I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close-Up. On this program, we feature leading newsmakers and the New York Times journalists who are covering them. This week, New York Times national politics reporter Astead Herndon joins me to discuss the politics and perception surrounding Vice President Kamala Harris. But first, the Mideast remains foremost on the mind of many New Yorkers. The New York Times has complete coverage from Israel and Gaza, and we're joined now by New York Times international correspondent Jeff Gettleman. He's recently been in the West Bank. He's also been spending time with the families of Israeli hostages. We're talking before the weekend and obviously can be overtaken by events, but Jeffrey, who's on the phone from the West Bank, what is it the hostages want the Israeli government and military to do next?
Sam, it's a really tense situation, and people are very worried, and they're also frustrated that they don't have a lot of information. So we've been speaking to families of hostages, and what's the hardest thing for them is not knowing. They don't have a lot of information from the Israeli government. They don't have a lot of information from their own sources. Their loved ones have been taken into captivity in a place that is in the middle of a war zone right now, and the men that are holding them are the same ones who slaughtered more than 1,000 civilians. And now there's all these families around the world, but concentrated mostly in Israel, that are just waiting for some information, some word, if their loved one is alive or dead, if they're healthy, what type of state are they being held in, and how to get them out. And that's this big question right now is how are they going to get these hostages out in the middle of this growing conflict?
As long as they know they're alive, and we hope they are, and we hope the families will find that out soon, it seems like there are only two alternatives: to invade and storm and find them, or a hostage exchange. Do the families have any preference for those two alternatives, none of which are particularly favorable?
Yeah, exactly, Sam. I think people want a negotiated release. They see that as the safest option at this point. The problem is Hamas is very difficult to talk to. Who do you talk to in Hamas? And these are the same people who committed these atrocities in Israel. So there's absolutely no trust. So it's a really difficult situation. It's probably one of the most complicated hostage crises that we've seen in I don't know, in recent memory. There's maybe 200 hostages. Their ages are from less than a year old to over 90 years old. Some have special needs, medical conditions, or disabilities. Some are soldiers. Some are wounded. And there's also a whole different, these people are from many different countries, from Israel, obviously, but also from the U.S., from France, from Italy, from Austria, from the Philippines. So it's really, really complicated. And the idea of going in there and just storming your way toward them and freeing them, nobody's really talking about that. They're believed to be held in a tunnel system beneath the streets of Gaza. They're believed to have been split up into smaller groups. And so the bottom line is it's very risky, dangerous, difficult, and possibly unrealistic to just try to rescue them by force. And so then that brings up the question of who do you talk to? How do you work with Hamas? What do you offer in exchange? And all that's being discussed right at this moment while we're talking.
Jeffrey, a couple of years ago, I was at a dig, an archaeological dig in Ashkelon, not far from the border with Gaza. And I was given hotel accommodations, and I was assured that I was on the north side of the hotel, which would be away from the rockets coming from Gaza. It didn't make me feel much more secure. What about the people living near Gaza, living where you are now on the West Bank? Why do people live there? Don't they know that they're taking a big risk by being so close to the rockets that could come in, or in this case, as unusual as it turned out to be, an actual invasion from Gaza?
Sam, it's a really complicated question. So some people felt like it was relatively safe, that Hamas had kind of given up on any massive terrorist attack, that things were normalizing, that people from Gaza were working in Israel, and It was stabilizing. It wasn't perfect. There was still like a lot of, fear, but it was a fear that people were used to living with. So much that these organizers planned an enormous dance party 2 kilometers away from the Gaza border, where thousands of young Israelis were partying in the middle of the desert on October 7th. And that was one of the first places hit when these militants burst out of Gaza, and they slaughtered hundreds of unarmed people and kidnapped dozens. Many of the people that are in captivity right now in Gaza came from that big outdoor rave party. And so Gaza was this place that people viewed as an issue, as a problem that the region needed to solve, but not as a clear and pressing danger. Had they wouldn't have planned a big dance party right on the edge of it.
Is there anger toward the Israeli government and toward the military for what appears to be a lapse in security? And how much of that anger seems to be directed to Netanyahu for all of the infighting that seems to have created that lapse?
There's a lot of anger. There is a lot of anger. People are really frustrated that the much celebrated Israel and military and intelligence apparatus failed to prevent this attack, that they didn't know it was coming. How could you have 1,500 heavily armed terrorists lining up at the border with bulldozers and pickup trucks, break through the border fence and come storming into communities all around Gaza, taking hostages, slaughtering people? How could that have been allowed to happen? And then there's also frustration about the response. Once it started happening, people were making panic calls. I've seen some really disturbing and horrifying videos that have been shared with me from the families of hostages and victims of the last calls that their loved ones made, panicked, sitting in a car, breathing heavily, watching these gunmen close in, and nobody's there to protect them. They were calling their parents for help. They were calling the army. They were calling the police. And some of these sieges went on for hours before any Israeli defense forces showed up. So there's two problems. Why wasn't it prevented? And why wasn't the response faster and stronger? And people are haunted by those questions. And yes, many people didn't like Benjamin Netanyahu before this. The country was very polarized. And now there's even more complaints about him. But at the moment, it's unified in a different way. People feel like their survival is being tested, and they're not bickering about politics or pointing fingers. Not so much. It's more, we need to organize, we need to unify, we need to all make sacrifices. That's what this moment calls for. That's what I've been hearing as I've been traveling this country for the last 10 days.
Jeffrey, you're on the West Bank now, and you're beginning to hear some reaction, both from Palestinians there. What is their reaction to the Palestinian Authority, to the violence in Gaza?
There's a lot of anger, Sam. People here are furious on all sides. Israelis are furious and depressed and disturbed and terrified about what happened on October 7th. And Palestinians are very upset about the response, where Israel has been bombing the Gaza Strip very heavily. Thousands of people have died. There was this strike on a hospital a few nights ago that the Palestinians blamed on the Israeli military, and the Israeli military has released information that makes it appear, according to them, that it was actually an errant rocket or missile fired by Palestinian terrorists that misfired and crashed into this hospital. But almost nobody in the Palestinian community believes that. They think it was an Israeli strike that took out hundreds of innocent people. So every day, it's just so sad. Every day, there's more tension, more suspicion, more grief, more fear on both sides. And it's just growing and growing and growing. And it's really hard sitting here talking to people, watching this, every hour to see how it's going to end anytime soon.
Does the reaction on the West Bank among Palestinians make them more sympathetic to Hamas or less?
I think there's a lot of sympathy for Hamas. They're seen as a defender of Palestinian independence and a defender of Palestinian rights. And people in the West Bank, the Palestinians, feel so oppressed and abused and hopeless that they are willing to support an organization that is a known terrorist organization that kills civilians as part of its tactics. It's gotten to that point that even very reasonable people who don't seem bloodthirsty, who don't, seem to have bad values, even those people say, I think it was wrong for Hamas to kill civilians in this case, but I support them because they are speaking out for us and nobody else is. I've heard that a lot.
Jeffrey, a quick last question. You've come from Ukraine, where you've been covering another war. How does this compare to what's going on there?
God, I don't even know how to start with that one, Sam. This one feels a lot more, feels like more visceral. It feels more intimate. Almost every Israeli is connected to the atrocities in one way or another. They lost a loved one. They might know somebody who's in captivity. Their friends or family are serving on the front lines. Israel is a tiny country. You can drive, from one hot spot to another in an hour or two. And so everybody's connected by this web, this very tight network that unites this country. So the war just feels more personal. And these atrocities that were committed against Israelis, it stirs up all these memories of the Holocaust and of the worst moments of anti-Semitism in history. And so there's just a lot of fear. And Ukraine, of course, Ukrainians feel horrible about what's been happening, and they're fighting for their country against a much bigger army. And they don't have the equipment, and they don't have, nearly the resources that they need to push the Russians out of their country. But it's such a big territory, and it's a much bigger place that many parts of Ukraine feel kind of normal today. Life goes on. People go to work. People go to school. Israel, everything has shut down. The schools are closed. Businesses are closed. So many people have been mobilized. It's like the whole society is part of this conflict now.
Jeffrey Gettleman, international correspondent of the New York Times, thank you for joining us on the phone from the West Bank. Coming up next, In Search of Kamala Harris. Our next guest writes about race, class, and politics for the New York Times. He hosts its political podcast, The Run-Up. In the run-up to 2020, Astead Herndon followed Vice President Kamala Harris's presidential campaign. Writing this month for the New York Times Magazine, he shared a recent interview he had with the vice president. He also examined her ambitions, her public perception, and the challenges she faces from her own political party. Now, Astead, I hope I have an easier time interviewing you than you seem to have interviewing her. Why did she give you such a hard time?
I think that's a good question. Yeah, I followed Vice President Harris when she was running for president originally. And, this is oftentimes how these interviews go. This is not someone who really likes to kind of expound or expand. It's a prosecutor, and she kind of treats interview questions like that, particularly when you're asking for an affirmative vision or you're asking for her to really lay out something. It's often responded to with a question. She'll ask, what do you mean by that? Or I don't believe in those labels, or really kind of shut down the premise. And it's kind of been how it's gone for the last last several years. I thought this time would be different, actually. This is someone who's in a different role, has had years kind of on the in the White House to kind of reflect the president's vision. But when we sat down in Chicago, it was still that same type of dynamic where, this is not only someone who is kind of not acknowledging the swirl of criticism that surrounds her, but is frankly kind of thumbing her nose at it. And I think that's really what came through in that interview.
The headline of the magazine piece in the Times was In Search of Kamala Harris. Did you find her for real? Who is Kamala Harris?
Yeah, I think I would like to believe so. The title was implying the kind of months-long journey that this piece really went on. I first went out to follow her in Munich at the security conference in February. Just think about how long that's been. I saw her in Chicago, in Boston, in Orlando. I went out to California to talk to people who had worked with her for years. And so it was trying to get a sense of someone who really isn't really doing that for you. A lot of times as political reporters, you have a clear story story that a politician is trying to tell about themselves, either about their bio or about their political beliefs. I don't think we really have that from her. And so I was trying to find that basically. And I really do think that you get a sense of someone who has been kind of consistent through their career, someone who has been a kind of tough prosecutor and has kind of really lived in that reactive space, not necessarily setting policy going forward, but thinking about accountability, thinking about justice, thinking about how people feel safe. The thing is, we haven't really seen her update that thinking since she's been moved into a different role. She hasn't been a prosecutor since Attorney General days in 2016, and as senator and as a presidential candidate, and now as vice president. I think there's a little bit more of an onus on her to kind of speak as a leader of the party and kind of shape the future, which isn't really we haven't really seen so far. So that's what the title of the piece was trying to show, was that it's easy to find Vice President Harris, whether it be on the trail or whether it be in D.C. But what does that mean? And what does Vice President Harris represent in the party? That's a little tougher, and that's what we were trying to kind of cobble together through all those interviews and through all that reporting.
And I think at least you did that as thoroughly as anyone possibly could, especially since she declined to give you the second promised interview. Nobody really knows what a vice president does, often including the vice president, him or herself. She, according to an NBC News poll that you quote, has the lowest favorable rating of any vice president since the poll began. But what is the problem? Is this a problem of style, or is it a problem of substance? And the big question I think people have, since she is the vice president, since at this point she is likely to be Joe Biden's running mate again, what kind of president would she make?
Yeah, I think those are all really great questions. To the kind of first set, I think that Harris is someone who really sees her role as an executor of other people's vision. So, in the vice presidential, to your point about the structure of the role, you're not the one who's actually on the hook to kind of proclaim your own vision. And there's been some vice presidents who have carved out their own lane, but it's a difficult role. I mean, Jen Palmieri, the former White House comms director, said in our story, this is not one where she'll be set up to fail, but it's not as if she's set up to succeed, right? The administration, the White House, is not creating a political program for Kamala Harris to shine. They're creating one for Joe Biden to do so. And so it's a place of her trying to find somewhere to fit within that. But I think it does go beyond just the structures of the role. In our reporting, we really try to show how this is really someone whose kind of reputational damage really started when she ran for president. When you think about the kind of 20 candidates who ran in 2019, 2020, Harris was really unique. She's the only one who started in that top tier and fell out, right? She's the only one who kind of did not match those type of expectations, whereas other people just failed to kind of start and take off from the jump. I think that that's kind of been a looming question since then, is that in the time that when she was most available to kind of define herself to the rest of the country, that didn't really happen. And so now you're in that number two role, and it becomes more difficult to execute. To your question about what president would she be, the question is really open. I mean, when I pose to people kind of the ideological concerns, is she a progressive? Is she a moderate? Would she govern like Joe Biden? Would she be more open to the left? You get all range of responses. Some people call her a progressive. Some people say, oh, that's absolutely not true. Some people, kind of put her more in the lane of Joe Biden. So someone described her as radically competent, just saying, she wants evidence in front of her and then the ability to make a decision. Those are all kind of all gamuts of flavors of the Democratic Party, but it doesn't help kind of voters feel secure and understand kind of where you are leading forward. I think that has added to that kind of perception that you mentioned with the NBC poll, but we shouldn't downplay the obvious things too. There is racism, there is sexism, there is someone who hasn't been able, who looks and acts differently than the mold of politician we've been used to, and that certainly can't be discounted.
Why was she chosen as Joe Biden's running mate? You ask, was she the highest profile diversity hire?
Yeah, and I wanted to kind of ask that question to kind of like provocatively make people think about the ways that we use these kind of identity descriptors to fill these roles. At the time in which Joe Biden was selecting a vice president, which remember, the world had kind of changed overnight. He first kind of made the promise to select a woman at the end of the Democratic primary. But then 3-4 months later, you had the George Floyd protest, you had the onset of the coronavirus, you had a completely different campaign trail just in that short period of time. And so you had real pressure on Joe Biden and those around him to select someone who would speak to that moment. Now, when I talk to people around him, they say that this is not something he felt tethered to, that he was very open to choosing someone like Gretchen Whitmer, that he was open to choosing someone like Amy Klobuchar, but it was a conversation. Could two white Democrats win? Did there need to be a person of color on the ticket? But what Harris provided was an ability to kind of do all of the above. Not only was she a senator, not only had she a name recognition for running for president, she also was someone who obviously is Black and Indian and would excite the party in terms of including new faces. And when I think about the Elizabeth Warrens of the Gretchen Whitmers of the world, Warren's problem was also that she was older and kind of the same generation as Biden. They wanted that contrast. And so all of those are very valid reasons to select a number two. I just think it comes at a different kind of time when there's more political pressure on that role because of Biden's age and because of the looming threat of Donald Trump. And so, I think it's both a style substance question, also a structure of the role, because they say they were thinking about it as a governing choice for Biden's first term, where a lot of people across the country in media and I think regular voters thought that Joe Biden was setting up the future of the party.
Has she had a signature issue of her own, or even one that's been foisted on her for political reasons?
Yeah, her origin, of course, is criminal justice and public safety. That's where she's made her name. That's the issue she's most closely tethered to. But our reporting shows that this has not been someone who's tried to embrace that as they've gotten to the national stage. So we've had this robust national conversation on where should policing and crime and kind of crime and public safety be. And she's not really led that, more so than has kind of followed the mainstream weather vane of the Democratic Party on that. When we see her in the White House, she's chosen different issues. She chose voting rights. She was stuck with the kind of root cause of the migration crisis from Biden, who assigned her that issue, even though she did not want it, our reporting shows. And so she's tried to find different things moving forward. Since the Dobbs decision, she's leaned more into abortion rights as a focus of her stump speech. She's embracing gun safety reform as a way to reach out to young voters ahead of 2024. But all of those things are very much not the thing that she's most known for, right? Because the thing that people most know her for, the thing that's informed her career has been the thing that she's not really chosen to make her brand in DC and nationally. She shifted away from that. And I think you're going to see abortion and gun safety really be the main topics of focus for her as she pitches herself to people of color, to women, to young people, to try to shore up the kind of core coalitions of Biden's base ahead of 24.
Very quickly, some people in the party, antagonists because of his age or other reasons, because of policy, hope that Joe Biden decides not to run. Some people hope that he decides to replace Kamala Harris on the ticket. What is the likelihood that she will not be his running mate or not be on the ticket in 2024?
I would say it's near zero. Joe Biden is running again, and Joe Biden will have Kamala Harris on the ticket again. And that has been unequivocal from the White House, from the campaign. We had Anita Dunn, his chief kind of campaign leader, on record in that story, saying they never thought about it in replacing her, never polled replacing her. And we had another advisor in there, but I think it's a really important nugget. Biden was also what was actually in 2012, Barack Obama their campaign polled replacing Biden with Hillary Clinton. And it personally stings Biden to this day, one of his advisors said. And so they said that you couldn't even bring up the idea of replacing Harris because it's something that's personal and sensitive to him. And so it's been one of those things that's happened in the media, kind of in kind of discussions of politics, but it's completely disconnected with how the campaign thinks. There is no chance Harris is replaced as of now. And, I think that's the real that really sets up a collision course for 2024. Either this is going to be someone who needs to kind of like more affirmatively give a message that voters latch onto and feel more comfortable with, or I think the Democratic Party might have a pickle on its hands.
Astead Herndon of the New York Times, thank you for joining us. And coming up next, I'll share some personal thoughts on how a 19th century opera resonated in today's headlines. Last week, I was lucky enough to attend the Metropolitan Opera's performance of Verdi's Nabucco at Lincoln Center. Before the curtain rose, Peter Gelb, the Met's general manager, announced to the audience that in memory of those whose lives were lost or threatened in the latest Middle East violence, the performance would begin with the stirring anthem from Act 3, Va Pensiero, the chorus of the Hebrew slaves. Rendered by the incomparable Met chorus, the performance was unforgettable. The story of Nabucco and the words of Va Pensiero were written in 1842. They're about events that occurred more than 2 millennia ago. They immediately resonated in today's headlines. The opera recounts the period of Babylonian captivity after the Jews were driven from Jerusalem following the destruction of the First Temple. The title, Va Pensiero, literally means go thought. The captives are teleporting their thoughts to a better place, to their homeland, a place from which they have been uprooted, a place they long for, to return in peace and freedom. The lyrics are poignant, even in English. Oh, my country, so beautiful and lost. Oh, so dear yet unhappy. Let the Lord inspire a concert that may give to endure our suffering. Those lyrics seem universal today. They could be sung by Israeli civilians who believe they were safeguarded by a broken government and are now under siege, by Palestinian civilians herded into squalid refugee camps and denied enlightened leadership, by innocent hostages barbarically abducted. Listen to their lament. Oh, my country, so beautiful and lost. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.